We've called this series Radical Hope, Looking Beyond the Museum. So I guess I should say something about what is radical hope. So radical hope is an idea that helps us to imagine the future after a moment of change. The term was first developed by philosophers to look at the big questions of human existence, knowledge, reason, and the mind. They wanted to better understand how people recover after a traumatic experience, for example, the loss of their culture. Now, philosopher Jonathan Lear illustrated this idea using the example of the experience of Chief Plentycoo. Chief Plentycoo was a 19th century chief of the Crow Nation, and the Crow Nation were buffalo herders and buffalo hunters. And by the late 19th century, the buffalo in the United States, as many people here will know, had been wiped out. So what Chief Plentycoo had to do, what he was faced to do, was to with the end of their traditional way of life, was to reimagine their culture. They couldn't go back and recreate it because the buffalo were gone and the buffalo were not going to come back in the same kind of way. So radical hope is about reimagining culture and reimagining the future. So radical hope events in the museum aim to explore contemporary changes in museums and to reimagine museum practice. So on these events, we're focusing on how Western museums have relied on colonial ideas that have hidden or erased the many stories and ways of knowing in favour of promoting one viewpoint. The Reimagined Museum should be a place that supports all people to share their ways of knowing and to tell their stories. This series is led by researchers and global community partners from around the world, and we hope to unpick thoughts around colonial practice. So tonight's conversation is the second part of a kind of double act, really. So 2 weeks ago, we explored how the interpretation of artist interventions in museums affects the museum experience and encourages us to think in new ways or to see new perspectives. So on the balance of that, this evening's conversation, Let's Talk Labels number 2, explores museum interpretation from the perspective of those working in the museum on a daily basis. Now, these events are funded by Torch, which is the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, and we are recording this event and we will share it online after the event, and we'll put in some links into the chat about how you might do that. And we'll also be sending a follow-up email a couple of days after the event, which will also have that link. So if you don't get it, don't worry, it will be coming your way. Also, please keep your eyes open. There will be a survey coming, a link to a survey. We would really love your feedback. It helps us to adapt and change. We also look at the chat as a form of evaluation of the events as well. So please do ask us questions in the chat, and hopefully you will answer some of ours in the survey. So I think I've spoken for long enough. I think we'll now go straight over to my colleague Marenka and her Pitt Rivers Museum guests.
Welcome and thank you everyone for joining us for our second webinar on Let's Talk Labels. Last week, with the help of artists Aiko Soga, Royce Eng, and anthropologist Daisy Bisnix, we looked into how we could expand and reimagine the interpretive museum experience. From our conversation, interesting points about multi-sensory interpretation arose, but also the fact that the physical limitations of the museum, i.e. the space has sometimes not been imagined and designed to host interpretation that is outside of very Eurocentric norms. And in the case of Royce and Daisy's exhibition, A Season in Shell, you may end up actually physically breaking the museum. If you weren't able to join us last week for the conversation, please watch it on YouTube. The link is in the chat. This week, we are bringing the conversation back into the museum, more specifically how decolonizing labels, language, and practice can happen across museum departments. As more cultural institutions have begun to think more critically and thoroughly on decolonization, anti-racism, their role within problematic histories, and their future, we have seen a proliferation of roles and job descriptions for curators of hidden histories, problematic histories, slavery, and empire, etc. While these positions signal the sector's growing dedication towards change, it can often read as though these key persons are responsible for rolling out the entire decolonial program. However, for a real shift to occur and be embedded with institutions, every department and member of staff has to be able to see the processes of coloniality occurring within their area of work, how it has shaped the fundamentals of their position, and how to challenge and subvert it. Thus, today I'm joined with some of my fellow colleagues from the Pitt Rivers Museum to share and discuss how language, labeling, and decolonial thought have come into play within their different roles, and how our various roles interacted during this process. You will hear from Faye Belsey, the Deputy Head of Collections, Rebecca Plumbe, the Clothworkers Conservation Intern working on the What's in Our Drawers project, Beth McDougall, Families and Communities Officer, and Tandiwe Wilson, our new Messiah Living Cultures and Taking Care Project Assistant and former Collections Officer for the Multaka Project. Their individual short presentations will be followed by a conversation and then a Q&A session. Without further ado, Faye, over to you.
Thanks, Marenka, for the introduction. So I just wanted to introduce today's talk a little bit with discussion with some contextual information about the way in which we organise and catalogue information in the museum and some of its pitfalls and challenges that are posed by the systems that we have in place, and how that kind of can make the decolonising intention that we all have and that we're all working to quite difficult in terms of how we translate decolonising ideas around, how we tackle some of the problems with the histories of how the collections came here into how we translate it into practice. And like Marenka said, really for that to happen, it needs to happen across all the museum departments. And the way that we do things perhaps need to change. But to change these systems can be quite tricky. And the systems I'm talking about in particular as Deputy Head of Collections are the kind of systems which we have in place, collections management systems, to categorise and to classify the information that we have about the objects. So I spend a lot of my time in my role across collections looking at our database systems, cataloguing collections on a computerized database, but also interrogating documentation from original documentation on ledgers, session entries, index cards, related documents and correspondence and letters. And I think that that's a good place to start, is by asking, looking at all of this kind of cataloguing, the way we organise information, and ask, well, why do the labels, the problematic labels that Marenka's been working with in the museum, why do they look like they do? Why is that information being privileged over other information? And I think a lot of the reason for why is to do with the quite Eurocentric westernized way that as an ethnographic museum, we still have to categorize and classify the information in quite a scientific way. So the database that we use, for example, we still have fields to classify things by type of object, by class of object. And we have fields by which we can say an object is from a particular cultural group. And some of those cultural group listings and the geography of where objects have come from, particularly colonial objects, has changed over time, or the cultural group names haven't changed, but what people maybe refer to has changed, or how people are referred to and choose to be referred to, want to be referred to, has changed. And also, if there's room in our cataloguing systems to accommodate other ways of knowing. So the fact that, an object, when it comes to a museum, isn't inanimate objects, particularly some of the problematic objects. So we may think about human remains, but also there are objects associated with spiritual beings and that have life in the object, that it's a problem that they're here in Oxford. And how do we articulate that in a database, which is asking us to still scientifically, in a way, classify things as a type of thing that needs to go in a box labelled as this type of thing in our museum store, and needs to be classified in this type of way for us to kind of extract the information about it and to organise it and to understand it and just to keep it in the museum. So I'm going to talk briefly with that in mind about an example from way back, from 2009, when I was a relatively young assistant curator, young in my career in ethnographic museology. So I was being trained as an archaeologist, which is slightly different approach to ethnography. Again, in the Pitt Rivers Museum, this idea of classification, which I know I'm going on about, but I'm a bit obsessed with, because we still classify things in our database. We have a little A or an E. So an A for archaeology and E for ethnography, which I think actually is one of the less problematic classifications that we attribute to things compared to some of the other ways we classify and order information. But these like early classifications determine how knowledge, ideas of knowledge, understanding of knowledge are ordered in the museum, and the classifications still kind of inform and hold bearing on the way that we do things today in 2021. So even in 2009, you know, these things were in my mind. I was kind of thinking about them. And it really came to the fore. So in 2009, I was really lucky to be part of a visit of delegates from Haida Gwaii. So Haida Gwaii is an island off the coast of British Columbia. It's quite remote. And we have some really iconic pieces from Haida material culture in the museum. So the most iconic and most kind of notable one is the house post in the court of the museum, and a delegation in 2009 came from Haida Gwaii to look at the material culture that we have in the museum, and I was deputy head of collections then, acting deputy head. It was the first time I'd been involved in a big kind of source community Indigenous group visit, and it was quite a big deal for the museum, for me personally, and it was kind of quite life-changing for me, having, it sounds a bit dramatic, but having those Haida delegation of around 20 people come, there may have been a bit fewer, come and have a look at over 300 pieces, objects of their material cultural heritage here in Oxford. And during those visits, I was responsible for a part of, as well as coordinating the logistics of the visit, took a role in note-taking. So today, when we have researchers come and look at research the collection, we print out the information that we have available for them. So again, I was saying, you know, why do our labels, why does our interpretation look the way it does? And that's because often the information that we have about the objects is always prioritized or privileged information about where or how the object came to be in the museum. So about the person who collected it, in like what context, and more about the collector, and that's where the focus has been, and less about perhaps the people who made the object, the context, what the object was used for. So we maybe know less about those things than we do about how it got to Oxford and who collected it. And so this visit from the Haida, or from anyone actually, when people come to the museum, we're keen to not correct our information, but enhance our database entries with more context, to better understand the objects and their use, like why they're here, for them to become more kind of tangible, I guess. And so we print out the database entry. We share that information with, I mean, it's online. I say we share it, it's available. Anyone can go and have a look on our online catalogue. And, you know, that's the information that we already have. And often it might be really scant. It might not say much at all. Other times it might tell us a lot about the object. It's kind of varying levels of documentation that comes with an object when it comes to the museum. But, you know, it gets deposited in the museum, and then it has a life thereafter. And, you know, that as part of its life in the museum is another part of its kind of story. And then researchers come, delegates come, Indigenous communities come, people come, look at these objects, and then we're kind of trained, or at least at the time, 2009, so it was in my training to take notes when the Haida were looking at the various objects that we had out for them. And in my training, it was kind of, it sometimes feels like extracting knowledge. It doesn't feel very reciprocal sometimes, and it feels more about kind of getting as much information as we can about the object to enhance the database entry, to make that object more like meaningful, more useful as a kind of thing for research or for whatever. And so this visit by the Haida, I was a couple of days in. Okay, so in 2009, when the Haida came to visit, I was acting as a note taker. So part of my job was to take down, kind of listen in to the conversation that the Haida were having around the object, take notes. These notes would later be entered on the database, the museum database, and kept as a record, a related document for the collection as a whole. So I did that, and it was it was interesting because so the Haida group were made up of elders, young people. It was quite a dynamic group, and it took us a while to get into a kind of rhythm of the visit, and also for many of the Haida, some of them hadn't left Haida Gwaii before, you know, and to come to England, to come to Oxford, to a museum, to see objects from part of their material culture in a museum in Oxford was quite difficult for some. And yeah, I was really keen to record this information. So there were these sticks, and hopefully you can see a photograph of one of them now, and a carved stick with a kind of representation, figurative representation of a person, a head carved at one end. On the database entry, it suggested that these were model drumsticks used by, well, the word, again, the terminology in the database is medicine man, or by a shaman, but it was a bit vague, it was a bit unclear, and so I wanted to know if they were drumsticks or not. So, you know, I kind of asked, obviously, do you think it's a drumstick? They weren't sure, they were discussing it. I asked maybe 2-3 times, and I realised, reflecting on the visit, we've reflected after each day, and then more generally on the visit as a whole, you know, it wasn't for me to ask that, it wasn't for me to push that, and it just wasn't correct of me, or good of me, good practice for me. I thought it was. I was in my training to find out what these sticks are, so I can write it on the database, and, you know, we can sort out that problem of classification. Do I classify it as under music, or do I classify it under ceremonial, or what do I classify it under? But actually, they didn't know. They hadn't seen things like this before. So me pressing them to, you know, then actually that was not important. It was important to me. But since 2009, I've thought about that a lot, and I've thought a lot about kind of how we classify things, and what the problems are in classifying things and in documenting things. So if we go to the next slide, there's a screenshot of the database entry for the drumsticks. So it's just to show you a bit what our database looks like, our collections management system. So you can see in there, you can see a few problems, but you can see this problem of classification. So we've got musical instrument, model, striker, figure. But if the research notes, actually, the delegates wondered if it was something that could have been used by a shaman, and there is general consensus among delegates that the stick as part of the set was not a drumstick. So that's the conclusion they came to. Still, we have it, keyword, musical instrument, but, you know, we were actually told in 2009, probably not a drumstick, but still this classification exists. You can also see in the primary documentation field, Canada, Queen Charlotte Islands, Haida Indians. Well, the Queen Charlotte Islands, formerly the Queen Charlotte Islands, because they're actually not a sovereign state anymore. They're their own island. They're the Haida Gwaii Islands. So you can see the problems with the shortfalls of how things are documented, how things exist, and how then you end up with a label that is just incorrect, or is offensive, or is not appropriate. So if we move to the next picture, there's just a picture of the drumsticks as a whole. But if we move, so that there they are as a kind of bundle with just their accession number on that label. So moving on again, it made me kind of again think about how objects are labelled and numbered and things. So the next slide shows these are a selection of Haida objects. So and it just shows again, so we have the documentation on the database, but actually it shows the kind of scant disregard for labelling objects that curators had. So Harrison, who's a missionary, where most of these, he collects most of the Haida collections that we have in the Pitt Rivers Museum, and this is kind of like what is red paint effectively. So now if we were to label an object put the session number on it, you can see it on the salmon, the top picture, a little white number. It's a completely reversible process, so we could remove that number if we wanted to. Whereas here, it's kind of plastered in red capital letters in really prominent places on the object. What it is, who it's from, and when it came from. And it's really, so again in 2009, we had all these objects out for Haida people they'd never seen these objects before, and here they were, having been defaced, really, graffitied, and we'd had to present them like that, because we can't reverse this, we can't remove this label without causing damage to the object, which my colleague Rebecca will talk more a little bit about with her drawers project, which we're moving on to. And then also if we move to the next slide, so really this is a case example that I've taken from 2009, but relating to that, the Haida collection as a whole. So there's a display case in the lower gallery of the museum. It's called Rank and Status. And in it, it's just objects from Haida Gwaii, including a button blanket from the Hudson Bay Company. So here there's various labels that I'm showing you, and you can see how kind of how reductive a label can be. So it just says, old Pitt Rivers Museum label, and in fact the display label in rank, status and prestige on the northwest coast of America, it still captions the object, still has Queen Charlotte Islands in there. The focus is on the Hudson Bay Company. It doesn't really, it doesn't make any reference to the role that the Hudson Bay Company played in kind of imperialism, in the rise of global capitalism, and all of the kind of issues that came with the Hudson's Bay Company. It tells you, well, it was a trade blanket from the Hudson Bay Company, highly prized. I think it also said that somewhere, I can't see it now, so they're no longer worn. Well, actually, button blankets are really important in Haida culture and Northwest Coast culture. They are worn today. They're made today. They're worn at graduation ceremonies, children graduating from primary school, and we exhibited this blanket in an exhibition on trade, which I co-curated back in 2011. And again, this, it was an exhibition about trade. It still is hugely problematic in what was omitted from that exhibition, but the label, hopefully you can see, is a little bit more fulsome and contextualizes the button blanket for Haida people today. So on that note, I think I've rambled on enough. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Rebecca to talk a bit more about some of these issues with a project she's been working on. So, yeah.
Thank you, Faye. I can definitely link to some of the things that you said in your first talk, specifically to do with sort of scant information on labels. So I'll just share my screen. If I can find the right button. So hopefully you can all see that. So yeah, my talk will be a little bit of a case study about a specific object that I found in one of the drawers that I'm working on. But to give you all a little bit of context about what I do in my day job at the Pitt Rivers Museum, I'm working on the What's in Our Drawers project. So this involves improving the display environment of objects which are located in lots and lots of drawers we have in the court and the lower gallery spaces at the Pitt Rivers Museum. So as you can see from these photographs on this slide, their current state is often very crowded and very unordered. So one of the biggest risks that's posed to objects is mechanical damage. So this action is from people opening and closing the drawers when they come and visit, because you can open the drawers as a visitor and have a look and see what's inside. But this repeated action means that objects are basically bashing against the drawer sides, or they're actually knocking into other objects. So that's not great in terms of the care of collection side of things. Another problem is that these drawers don't really have any contextualization. So apart from a very brief description given on the label at the front of the drawer, there isn't really anything to tell the visitors more about what they're seeing. You might be lucky and see some labels attached to objects which are facing the right way up. But apart from that, there isn't really anything to ground the objects and for people to read, really. So I did find a quote about the drawers in a journal article that was written back in 2014. So I'll just read the quote. "They are not part of an externally obvious narrative and do not attempt to tell museum visitors a story. The overall appearance of the contents is often quite crowded, perhaps even muddled or untidy." So that quote really sums up the dual problem we have with the drawers. So not only are the objects lacking contextualization, which makes it very hard for people to learn about the collections housed in the drawers, but the display environment isn't keeping the objects safe, and the likelihood of damage occurring is quite high. So as a conservator, it doesn't speak of the respect that we should be showing these objects. They deserve to be displayed properly and safely, with accompanying information for people to connect to and really learn about these collections. And Faye's had a massive role in sort of helping me curate these spaces, and she's also writing labels that will go in the bottom right hand corner of the drawers. So on the slide you can see some blank spaces and they will house those labels. But my work with this project has also uncovered a number of hidden objects which specifically link to colonialism and the British Empire. So as an example of a very hidden colonial history linked to an object, this slide shows a scroll from Myanmar, and it was literally found buried in a drawer out of sight. So you can see in the left-hand image, this is the picture of the drawer before any interventions were taking place. So before we'd made the housings, which you could see on the previous slide. So it's a bit of a mess, really, to be honest. And there's no way that the objects can be seen sort of cohesively as one. They are literally just placed into a drawer and shut away. And so when visitors come to open those drawers, there's very little in the way for them to actually engage with, apart from the very kind of scant descriptions on that paper card you see. But really, it doesn't really do these objects justice to have them in a drawer like this. And so when I came to looking at this object, so the object you can see on the right-hand side, this is the scroll. And the first thing I noticed was the handwritten label on the reverse side of the scroll. So this is a close-up of that label. And it reads, "Taken from Bowley, leader of the Kachins, Wuntho, Burma, Major R.C. Temple, 1894. So to give a little bit of context as to who Major R.C. Temple was, he was called Sir Richard Carnac Temple. He was an army officer, administrator and scholar. He served in India and Burma in the late 19th century and early 20th century. It was also interesting to read that he wrote extensively about the importance of anthropology. He said it could make a difference to a well-rounded colonial administrator, and even argued that there needed to be an imperial school of anthropology. But what really grabbed me was the word taken. I immediately had questions about how it was taken. So my first port of call was the museum's database, where I found a very short, sort of matter-of-fact description relating to the subject. And this read, paper belonging to Boli, the Kachin leader, who was killed at the taking of Wantho. So the Kachin people are an indigenous tribal group in Myanmar. But to me, to read that on the museum database, so bearing in mind that this information isn't sort of publicly displayed in the museum, it's on our database and staff can access it, and you might see it on the public-facing collections online databases. It's quite shocking, really, because it's obviously an act of violence. And I didn't expect to see that, I'll be honest. So the fact that the way in which it was taken was by force and through violence kind of really shocked me. And it made me think that if I hadn't looked up the object on the database, I wouldn't have known that at all. So it really brought home, you know, the importance of kind of looking for these things. So seeing that label, I questioned it and I thought, you know, the word taken, that's very sort of suggestive of something happening, but I didn't quite know what. So it brought it home to me that this object was pretty much hidden from view, and the information physically attached to the object was quite concealed and lacking in context. And it almost ignored its link to colonial oppression. So I wanted to know more. So I did some research into what happened at the taking of Wantho. So at this point in Myanmar's history, the British had hugely expanded their political influence in the country throughout the 19th century. There had already been 2 Anglo-Burmese wars, the first in 1824 to 1826, and then again in 1852 to 1853, and a third would occur in 1885. So I'm going to show you a photograph from 1891 taken at Wantho. So this image depicts the surrender of arms by the Wantho Sawa's rebel forces to the British authorities. The Wantho Sawa were the father and son team who gathered rebel troops to fight the British expansion, and they both pledged loyalty to the Kombaung monarch, having been raised within the Burmese court themselves. Accounts of Boli's death differ from the information given on the handwritten label. So in a book titled The Pacification of Burma, and you can see the sort of language, the colonial language used there. This was a book published in 1912 and written by Sir Charles Crosthwaite, who was the Chief Commissioner of Burma from 1887 to 1890. And he states that Boli was killed by mounted infantry in 1889, so that's 2 years prior to the date stated on that handwritten label. So there's really some room, really, for questioning how accurate the handwritten label really is, especially as we only read it from the colonial perspective. It indicates the need to make sure that object histories are truly reflective of events and perhaps most importantly, are not misleading. But nonetheless, this image is really striking, with the victorious and the defeated contrasting each other so starkly. And what happened here at this moment in time is so intrinsically linked to the scroll. It's the physical embodiment of this violent event. It's a part of its story that isn't part of the visible narrative of that object at the museum, due to the way the label doesn't really... This hasn't been an isolated incident, with stolen or looted objects also coming to light. Often these histories are mentioned on the labels, which are attached to the object, but they are really brief and they are missing detail, as Faye mentioned earlier. So there's even been an occasion where a label containing derogatory language has been uncovered. All of these instances have made me really think about the responsibility I have towards the collection, especially when it comes to redisplay. So if we're to display objects with complicated and often violent histories, then it's only right that we try to find out as much as we can about that object, especially if the information on the label has been written from only one perspective. And I think for me, it's important to recognise where my own limitations in my knowledge exist. And that's the point at which I ask Faye, or I go and ask Marenka or Tandy about what, you know, if they have any other opinions about what should be done with an object that's got a hidden history, because that might impact on the way it's curated or displayed within a drawer. So I think it's perhaps the first step in correcting the imbalance of voices that are heard at the museum, because when you dig a little deeper, you often find that there are whole peoples or experiences that haven't really been mentioned at all. It's these forgotten voices that need to be included when people come to visit the Pitt Rivers Museum. And I think it's especially important that histories like the one linked to the scroll are told. You only have to look at the news today and see the political struggles that are still going on in Myanmar and the current military coup. it's indicative of a long, continued period of unrest and upheaval, which can be linked right back to the period of British colonial control, which is represented by the materiality of the scroll and the label that the curator at the time gave to it. So that's really one of my case studies. And I suppose that's the most detailed example I found of working with something which has such a hidden history. And I think the fact that it was sort of almost concealed is one of the problems that I face in my job. So I'm uncovering objects that haven't been seen for a while. And so when you do come across things with almost like shocking, violent histories, I have to think really carefully about how I either conserve that object or whether we should put it on display. And if we do, what information do we make available for people to kind of learn more about what really happened? I hope that illustrates a little bit about the problems I have in my job and sort of the need for communication. But I'm going to stop talking now and I will hand over to Beth. So over to you, Beth.
Thanks, Rebecca and Faye. And it's really interesting listening to my colleagues who spend a lot of time with the objects, thinking about how they then translate into working with people, where I suppose for me, I'm going to take it broad again. So from Rebecca's case study to what I do in my role, to think about people first and then objects second. So what really interests me about the work around labelling matters is it gives us an opportunity to think about one of the vehicles within the museum and how that frames everything about the kinds of power imbalances that we see so wrought across the museum today. It really helps us to define that and to kind of give us a focus for understanding the role that we have as museum professionals in decolonising the spaces that we work in. So I know that some of this might have been covered already, but I was thinking that a label is presented as almost as fact when actually it's a didactic, generally single perspective impression of what something might be. And I know that Faye talked about the fact that it continues today that in the database we're still using the wrong terminologies to describe an object or a thing belonging to another person, and that's compounded within our labels that are still on display in the museum today. But having said that labels are a place of single perspective or often seen as fact, they're also a really good opportunity, and Marenka's really highlighted this in her work, for us to look at actually, we've now acknowledged the single perspectives that are more often than not incorrect and privilege a certain subset of information, mostly based on a kind of white Western supremacist viewpoint. Actually, how can we turn that on their head? How can we use these labelling systems to present multiple perspectives? And that's really something that I think a lot about in my work with families and communities. And more generally, how do you bring these ideas into the kind of public domain? So how do we shift those different power relationships? So labelling matter forefronts this issue. And one of the things that I was sort of smiling about as Rebecca and Faye were talking is that as collections and conservation specialists, they come up against the database and are frustrated by it time and time again because it won't give them the information they need. It tells you dimensions and it categorizes and creates these sort of pseudo-scientific impressions of what something is. And that is something that continually challenges us in public engagement, because when I first started working at the Pitt Rivers, which was about 5 years ago now, I wanted to talk about the object in our handling collections that our team is lucky enough to hold. And I'd off to go and do research in the museum, or I think, right, well, I've worked in museums for some time now, so I'll access the database, and I would just be confronted by this total lack of context. So where do you go next? Well, for us, Andy, who is the head of our department, is a really great font of knowledge from his conversations with communities coming into the museum over a long period of time. But if he's not there, where do we go next? Well, you always get told at school that you shouldn't use Wikipedia and Google to gain your knowledge, but that's really what often was left to us, because learning is all about kind of narratives and stories and helping people to understand things through an accessible lens. And we'd be left with dimensions. How do you tell a great story about the dimensions or physicality of the object where you've totally removed the human from it? So this is where I really started, and we've been kind of lucky over time with the work we've been doing around decolonisation to find ways in which actually we say, well, actually, hang on a minute, if I'm looking at information that's been written by one viewpoint through the labelling systems, I'm then going on to Wikipedia, which may have one particular not fact-checked or not multiple perspectives based viewpoints on it, and then I'm kind of taking this out into the public sphere. How can I get past that and recognize that I'm kind of compounding the issue by finding my information in the wrong places? How can I include the broadest range of communities and actually bringing those multiple perspectives into the museums? So one of the things that we've been working on is thinking about how we can use the family programme as a kind of platform or space to have conversations that bring together different cultural groups to kind of understand and learn from each other, so that the museum doesn't become the dominant place in sharing information, that it actually uses itself as a platform for the people that have the knowledges, that have the multiple perspectives to talk about their objects and the things that we hold in the museum. And a really great example of this is I've been working with Snowflake Books, who are a Taiwanese and Chinese community-based kind of knowledge exchange and illustration and book-based publishers who work specifically to connect families in this country with families living in Taiwan and China to start those kinds of cultural exchanges. I've been working with My Normal group who are an LGBT plus group in the city of Oxford, who have worked to present to families how you can talk about LGBT issues with children from a very young age. I've been working with the Museum of Colour and the Windrush group in the city to kind of think about how you bring stories of Windrush, Empire, the African Caribbean experience into the museum in a way that makes some of these narratives that are totally hidden, purposely or not, from view when you come into the museum as an everyday visitor. So starting to think about actually how do we start with people first and then connect back to the objects that we have in the museum, rather than objects and database first and then people second. And I would say that this is kind of the start of a really long process that needs to be refined and changed over time, that certainly I'm still doing a lot of learning around, that has inspired me and the team and the community engagement team that I'm part of to think about, if we are bringing in platform and supporting people in platforming their cultures and creating this point of exchange, how do we stop that being an extractive process? Because as Rebecca and Faye have already highlighted, and Faye did really beautifully with the extraction of knowledge from the Haida community, how do I not fall into the same place within the work that I do with the local communities in Oxford City? And one of the things that I have been working on is with a Community Connectors programme, which is with Nicola Bird from the Community Engagement team in the main Gardens, Libraries and Museums at the University of Oxford. And a lot of that work around community ambassadors or connectors, we've just changed the name. If people have looked up our work on community ambassadors before, you might be confused by that. But how do we make sure that those relationships with our local communities are equitable partnerships? And the Community Connectors programme is working really hard to kind of take down those power imbalances that have so often been between local communities and museums, and also make sure that the people we're working with are not only being paid for their knowledges, but also gaining from the experience of working with the museum as well. And this has brought lots and lots of learning over time. And I know later in this series, we will talk about the Community Connectors programme in more detail. And I know that Tandy will probably pick up on this in her conversation with you in a moment. But it's one of the things that fascinates me the most is that kind of unpicking of those power imbalances, recognizing where there's these kind of internalized or racist structures that stop us even seeing where we're going wrong within the museum, where we're continuing to go down and compound a path that doesn't open up to kind of multiple perspectives, but continues to close down to privileging often a white supremacist lens. And kind of why I love working with the people that are on this call is that we have, and I'm sure we're about to go on to this, really great conversations about how we can unpick, test and trace and learn from all of you on the call today as well, how we can do all of these things better. Where I think things have been going really well are a couple of projects that my colleagues have been working on. So Beyond the Binaries, which is a programme with LGBTQIA+ community members, which is around community curatorship of and reassessment of objects that are in the museum collections today, and also contemporary collecting that actually really demonstrates the experience of people who are LGBTQIA. We're working with Messy Realities, which is a programme working with researchers and community members to create community engaged research that looks at the lived experiences of people who have multiple health needs. And finally, one of the projects that Tandy will share in more detail is Multeka, Oxford, which is all about working with people living in the city today who've come to this community as forced migrants and looking at collections and ensuring that their knowledges and perspectives are not only seen within the museum space in sort of temporary exhibitions and more transitory methods of communication and public engagement, but actually start to move from conversations in the museum to actually impacting the database, which takes us in a full circle of, if you have a database that has multiple perspectives in it, then you're bringing those multiple narratives, you're not compounding that view of having one Western perspective on all of the objects that are held in an ethnographic museum. So I'm going to pass over to Tandy so that she can share a little bit more about Multeka as a case study. So over to you, Tandy.
Thank you so much, Beth. I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm going to start by giving you some background about the Multeka Oxford project, and then provide some examples of how collaborative work and using a collection called Textiles from the Arab World, donated by Dr. Jenny Balfour-Paul, helped us think critically about collections, practices, develop an online exhibition, and champion different perspectives in museum spaces. So Multeka Oxford is an inclusive volunteering project delivered jointly by the Pitt Rivers Museum and History of Science Museum, where we work in a three-way partnership with staff, volunteers, and the local community. And the project uses two museum collections, the Islamic Scientific Instruments of the History of Science Museum and the Textiles from the Arab World collection at the Pitt Rivers Museum, as a meeting point for people to come together and share expertise, knowledge, and skills. Therefore, we call it Multeka, because Multeka translates from Arabic to English as meeting point. So there are many benefits to working in this collaborative capacity. However, working at the Pitt Rivers, we are faced with a few challenges when implementing such work. Part of questioning our fundamental approaches in collections work is accepting, as my colleague Faye mentioned earlier, that we have and continue to classify and organize material using ethnocentric typologies which focus on the voice of the collector. And sometimes our labels and the database and database entries have missing or incorrect information. They may often lack context, have the potential to misrepresent or offend. And to counteract this, we've been doing a lot of work to address labeling, cultural group names, classifications, and facilitate opportunities for people represented in our museum to exercise agency and have their voices more centralized. While we understand diverse voices bring new perspectives, insights, often contribute additional knowledge and recontextualization that the cultural sector is incredibly keen to include, there is still this qualification argument that occurs. This conversation about whose knowledge is quantifiable, or who is ultimately qualified to give this information to the museum. So I'd like to share how we approach some of these practicalities and challenges when I worked with Multaka volunteers on textiles from the Arab World collection, which includes material Jenny Balfour-Paul, a researcher, indigo expert and artist, collected while living and traveling around the Middle East, North and West Africa, through the 1970s to 1990s. And the collection includes pottery, metalwork, photography, and textiles from Syria, Palestine, Yemen, Oman, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Tunisia, Senegal, Gambia, Mali, and Sudan. And as collections officer, it was my job to catalogue the collection and explore new opportunities for volunteers to work with these materials. And part of this included enhancing the museum database, so essentially working alongside volunteers to develop new interpretations, which provided deeper understanding and appreciation of the collection. In response to the pandemic, this became a digital research role. The research undertaken during this period eventually became an online exhibition, with volunteers' tastes and interests being the deciding factor for which objects and textiles would be included in the final exhibition. So, weaving connections, local perspectives from the Middle East, North and West Africa is a great example of co-curation and how this work translates in a curatorial capacity as a multivocal, polyvocal exhibition incorporating research and first-hand experience from 4 curators, 15 volunteers, and the collector Jenny Balfour-Paul herself. The exhibition itself is completely interactive with lots of ways of navigating and journeying through online galleries. I highly recommend visiting the Pitt Rivers website and having a look. Just a note to say that it is online only, so these objects aren't on display in the museum. There are lots of buttons where you can read participants' responses to exhibition items, watch recorded footage, and learn about how people made, used, and wore these items. So we found the process of including lots of voices incredibly fruitful. And that Jenny Balfour-Paul's research, supported by these many perspectives, revealed multifaceted and new narratives. What you're looking at here now are 2 pages from the exhibition catalogue that demonstrate the range of information that you can see in the exhibition. We included photographs from the museum, photographs from Multaka volunteers, notes, videos, poetry, and drawings, all touching on the contemporary relevance, cross-cultural connections, and personal stories these objects and the collection held. I'll also add that the designers Creative J were very present throughout the entire process, being at all our meetings and including the consultation process with Multaka digital research volunteers, and were incredibly supportive. During the consultation process, we had conversations with digital researchers about ensuring balance using non-hierarchical interactive buttons. We spoke about the inclusion of landscapes and how we were going to credit volunteers. We also discussed how myself and Faye would input their work into the museum database. Unfortunately, something that did come up which we were unable to achieve simply because of timing and funding was the use of multiple languages for accessibility. I would also say that because this exhibition had such a quick turnaround, just under 3 months, there wasn't enough time to work with digital volunteers on every stage of inception, design and promotion, which was a shame. Regarding the title, the curators found this one of the most difficult decisions, taking months, and we only decided on this final title a week before the launch. It took so long because we worked as a committee. We felt that it was important to use a new title rather than the collection title in order to acknowledge all cultural groups, countries, and material culture represented in the online galleries. This title was also a nod to a previous physical exhibition called Connecting Threads, which also highlighted our value for dialogue between cultures. And finally, the use of local can be read in two ways and understood in two ways. Firstly, local, as in local to the countries that they originated, and equally local referring to the community in Oxford and to the many people who have settled here. So I'll now share how Multaka got involved with the Labelling Matters project. I'll provide a quick overview for those who don't know. The instruments you see here in the Lamerphone case are called mbira. They're a family of musical instruments which are played at different events and social gatherings. They also hold spiritual importance and are symbols of resilience and liberation in Zimbabwe. And it happens to be a case in the lower gallery that I personally avoided for many years. Although it's filled with these lovely instruments, there's very little information, and other than colonial place names, sort of like Rhodesia sort of staring back at you from beneath the glass. Marenka spoke with myself and Multaka volunteer Tabo, and we took some time to think about how to approach the conversation for the display intervention and how best to address the historical and cultural importance of mbira. The film response included a musical performance by Miles and Kube, while Tabo and I provided some reflections as part of the Zimbabwean diaspora and with Shona Heritage. I really do recommend that you go to the Pitt Rivers website and listen to In Conversation with Tabo Miller, because he's incredibly eloquent, a brilliant storyteller, and unravels this very long, complex story of creative, intellectual, political, spiritual, and social significance. So in closing, I'd like to say that my experience in the project taught me a lot about the practicalities involved in the Pitt Rivers guiding principles to respect relationships between people's pasts, presents and futures, and respect objects, and respectfully listen to all our stakeholders and audiences. Because it's entirely impossible to theorize the best methods and ways for working equitably. You have to go through these challenging conversations and allow space for new thought. And my takeaway is that it's a matter of listening. And again, as Rebecca said, accepting your limitations and knowledge sometimes and asking, and also having the strength to accept that this is just part of the process of how we're going to revisit collections and curatorial practice. Thank you.
Thank you, all the speakers. You guys were great, and thank you to the audience for bearing with us with our technical glitches. But now we're going to go into our discussion / Q&A session, and I see that we have some great questions that have been asked. I'm first going to just kind of pose a question to all of the panelists, and my question is, I think, Beth, you talked about putting people first and about people-centered practice. And I just wanted to ask, how do you think in your kind of individual roles you can kind of make changes? And I know they might be small changes and that's fine, but how could you make changes within your specific roles to put people first?
Thank you, Marenka. That's a really great question. And yeah, I did say people first and collection second. And what do I mean by that? Well, to me, it's that often when you're looking to start projects, particularly when you're looking to kind of fund projects with our, the funders that are available to us, we often within museums start with collections first. And we say, oh, we'd really like to think more about this collection, or we don't have the knowledge for that. So how can we build on that knowledge? And therefore we think collections first, and then we go, right, who can be the partner for that? And often that, particularly when you're thinking around decolonising, and you're thinking, actually, I really need to decolonise my museum, right? I found the most problematic objects within the collection, so I'll start there. And then you invite the community into the conversation second. First of all, that can be quite triggering to the community members themselves, but also it could actually just be of like no interest to the people that you're working with as well. So actually by building long-term relationships, sustainable relationships that are with your local communities, so with our communities in Oxford City, but also with our global partners, then we're in a much better position to work together to find out which objects we'd like to talk about. So I suppose by putting people first, you're actually creating those that ability to co-produce, to choose together, and to kind of forefront not only sometimes difficult histories, but also to see where people might want to talk about the joy that they experience within their communities as well. So it's like, actually, instead of going, I'm the museum professional, so I know the collections really well, and so I know what you want to talk about, you say, actually, let's build the relationships, let's start the conversation. Are there any objects that can support us with that conversation? And I suppose in some ways, the Pitt Rivers team are incredibly lucky in the fact that we have the ability to work across so many different conversations with so many different peoples. And, you know, that's what keeps it exciting as well. So I'll pass on to somebody else.
I couldn't agree more, Beth. I think collections work can be very isolating. You're often organizing things or sat in front of a computer for hours at a time. And I was very lucky with this role because it was very different. I was sat right in between the collections department and volunteer services. So I was always, you know, working with people and talking to people, having conversations and consultations that informed all of our work. And I couldn't imagine working in another way now, like going back to, you know, going to the storeroom and just poring over collections, but not having that sort of interaction. And museums, you know, we're a place for education and entertainment. And how can we be that space without involving human beings, you know?
Yeah, I would agree with my colleagues, and you know, where I sit from collections in the collections department, where often we become quite obsessed with, as I said in my talk, you know, categorizing things and classifying things and putting things into categories, because the systems that we have in place kind of force us to think like that. For me, you know, the issues with what you then gain from reading an object through that kind of lens of a database is you miss the kind of the tangible elements of the object, the stories. So, you know, they're behind glass in the same way that they're in this database, whereas in the example I gave from 2009, you know, it's a long time ago now, but it was then for me that those objects really came to life and really like had new meaning, and I could engage with them more. And that was really, that couldn't have happened without the hider being here to tell me about those objects and for me to experience it in the room. And I think even since 2009, lots has changed, you know, that kind of, we're questioning the curatorial voice more, like why should the curator be the one to kind of have the voice in an exhibition and be the expert, and there's been a lot more co-curation, you know, like what Beth does, with engagement, with community engagement, Indigenous engagement, and arguably, you know, there should be more Indigenous curators and roles in the UK looking after these collections as well. So yeah, I think things are changing, where the focus is shifting on people, but equally, you know, we do have to kind of be guided by what we have in our collections, in terms of like what people, you know, we engage with, because the objects are kind of the springboard for that as well. But I think the work that Marenka's doing, engaging more contemporary artists, and thinking particularly now about what we acquire, what sort of objects we might acquire and add to the collections, like why actually acquire objects, like if you're just going to catalogue them and put them in a storeroom, whereas you should really acquire things with a mind to display them and use them and let them tell stories about the people who made them. And I think that's some of the work we're going to be doing and incorporating into our permanent displays, because those contemporary voices of these living cultures are kind of missing at the moment.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I know Marenka's going to say the next question and get us thinking that, but it's true that, you know, I've had the opposite issue where it's been about people first, and I've built really close relationships with the local community, and then we've come into the museum and the collections haven't been there. And that's particularly thinking about working with African and African Caribbean communities, that actually when we've come into the spaces, then I've been like, I'm really sorry, but actually we haven't got your community's objects on display. And then when you think about the collections that we hold in reserve, they're also not represented there, or they're with other museums on long-term loans, and it is that really difficult conversation where you say, well, actually, like, we are really interested in the opportunity for us to work together and for you to have the opportunity to kind of self-represent within this museum, but actually I'm really sorry that we can't necessarily find a way in through the collection. Having said that, because you're in conversation, then you know, as a group, we're going to say, well, actually, there's lots of African objects that can help us think through how we can have these conversations, because those objects travel with people to the Caribbean as well. So it's just having those various different routes in, and it's like, don't forget we have to think through the collections, but also you know, by privileging people first, then that really helps us to explore as many different options for storytelling and perspectives in the museum as possible. Back to Marenka.
Can I say something?
Oh yeah, Rebecca, go.
My internet died, but hopefully it will be okay. But in terms of sort of the people first, object second, I think as someone who like works with materials and objects a lot, it's always so valuable to hear from the people who perhaps made them or know how they're used, because sometimes it's just something that we as conservators aren't sure about. Like, scientific analysis will get you so far, but if you don't have the community involved perhaps, or you just don't have the connections you need to ask the questions, maybe about a residue that's on an object, should that be left on an object, should it be removed, is it bound together, that kind of thing. I think it's only a good thing, to be honest. And I think I've seen a lot more sort of co-curation, obviously with the work you guys have been doing at the Pitt Rivers, but there is definitely more room for that within sort of practical object conservation. Absolutely. So I hope we can facilitate that more as we move forward.
Thanks. So I've also seen quite a few questions about kind of, we talk about putting people first, but also, you know, questions around the idea of training, right? You know, like, how do we then train our staff? And that's something that came up in, I think, both Faye's and Rebecca's talk. Because I think, Rebecca, you said something about, like, you know, you realize that this is also kind of your responsibility of how, you know, responsibility of care for some of these objects as well. But my question is then, you know, well, I wasn't trained in conservation, but is this kind of training on, you know, kind of I would say almost like a decolonial stance of training, is that part of like the education, conservation education, and the same for Faye of collections, and how then maybe can we embed that better, you know, in that process of learning?
I think from sort of like personal experience, working at the Pitt Rivers has been my first experience sort of finding artifacts or objects that have a colonial history, an uncomfortable history. It's certainly not something that I was prepared for perhaps in my training. And I definitely think, you know, when it's kind of like accessibility, it's like you need to be aware of what you're going to find. I think especially when you're dealing with collections that are sensitive. So there is a gap there. Personally, I think, you know, like, you're kind of shocked into the realization when you do find an object like that, and you're almost going, I literally don't know. I feel really sort of overwhelmed and underprepared. What do I do? So there are definitely a lot of questions that go through your mind that need answering. But I'm not sure whether it's something to do with maybe a bias in training, or just the fact that it's not something that has started to be talked about maybe within conservation or the wider sort of heritage community. I think way more needs to be done at that level. So when you do move through to like work or other things, you at least have the thinking patterns and the questions in your mind that you may find these things. And I think that would be a good place to start. Yeah, I'll hand over to Faye though.
Yeah, I kind of agree that, you know, perhaps in our kind of training as curators, conservators, particularly of ethnographic collections, so it becomes, easy isn't the word, but it does become kind of normalized, you know, to kind of sit with these collections and not really question them, particularly in day-to-day work where you're just kind of, you know, slogging along. There's a lot to do. There's things that need to be catalogued, collections that need to be cared for, and so it just you know, it becomes again just sort of normal to not maybe be shocked by some of this, when we should absolutely be shocked, like Rebecca was. But sadly for me, when Rebecca told me that story, you know, I'd seen other examples and worked in the museum for a while now. But also I think we have to subvert our own practices a little bit. So back in 2009, it was, for example, the Haida collection and that visit. You know, my primary role in that project was to catalogue the kind of experience that improved the cataloguing records for those objects, and also to care for the collections. There were conservators in the room at the time, but actually the actual physical care of those collections became a bit secondary as Haidas began passing them around the room, and even in one instance with some gambling sticks, playing what became a very lively gambling game, where I'm sure I'm sure some of the sticks actually fell to the floor in this gambling game. But you know, actually, if those sticks weren't played with and that game wasn't played, then they would have just been a pile of sticks to me. Whereas watching that and seeing that, I remember at the time looking across the room at Heather Richardson, who's head of conservation then, and like going, is this okay? When I said to, I think it was Guy, I can't remember who else was playing the game, like, yeah, sure, go for it, play with the gambling sticks. Because I think also, you know, when objects come to a museum, again, they kind of get put behind a glass case, and that was never their intention. Some of these objects, especially ethnographic objects as well, were never supposed to kind of survive, you know, they were supposed to have been lived or had a life, and then they would have come to the end of their life, maybe a new one would have been made or whatever. And so I think we have to kind of, change our ideas and our own practices to kind of allow for that. And I guess a bit of it is about training, and that actually stems from training in kind of school level. So we've been working, Beth has been working a lot with Mel in our education department as well on like how something like colonial history is taught in schools, you know, at kind of GCSE A level and things like that, which is really important, and museums I think have quite a good role to play in changing that.
And also, there's something to be said about increasing the outreach through schools and like educational institutions. I think that's really going to be important to help increase the diversity within our own workforce too, because if you don't know about maybe conservation or curation maybe at that stage, then it might just bypass you, and the people that might be interested but may not have heard of a career in a museum like this may not get the chance to kind of contribute, I guess, and you're kind of missing out a whole generation of people who might have been interested and might have had some like really, you know, valuable insights to add. And I think it's sort of like maybe where more outreach needs to be done at a younger age. I think for me, I didn't really know about conservation until I was about 19 when I went to uni, and I had not heard of it until that point. So maybe, you know, like more outreach, always more outreach. And I know that you do a great job, Beth, with your team. But there's like, it's like a never-ending job, isn't it? It's like, how do we reach the maximum number of people possible?
Yeah, and the outreach thing is interesting as well, because I think we're recognizing as museum professionals that all of us have a part to play in it. So that we might have the learning teams that are more likely to go out, but actually we are all thinking about how our roles are bringing us more into contact with people. And it's really like good point around like the, you know, changing the curriculums and decolonizing curriculums, because actually the more that you do that work, the more that you're sharing multiple perspectives, the more that people can see themselves within the museums that hold objects connected to those histories. And hopefully, you know, back to your point, Rebecca, on broadening and creating more inclusive workforce, hopefully by seeing that actually your story can be told in museum spaces, that will help to kind of see yourself and recognise that you can have a place within the museum. So I think that's a really, really important point. And sort of going back to training, I think that we often as museum professionals put ourselves into places, and it's not to say like, woe is me, but that are difficult and triggering. And, you know, particularly like within the museum at Pitt Rivers at the moment, we're doing a lot of work on kind of unlearning and like around, centering, centering colonialism, but also thinking about white privilege and all sorts of things. And that kind of unlearning is a really important part of then us being able to work alongside wider communities with a sense of care and an acknowledgement that the perspectives we hold are one of many, and that we acknowledge that we are coming to it with a certain lens. And I wanted to kind of pick up, and I know that Laura has mentioned this in the Q&A, but about that kind of relationship between people and things. And I think this is something that Marenka can talk really well to. So I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Marenka, but the idea that not all cultures see that like distinct separation between people and things, that actually some of the things that we hold in the museum are actually people, they're actually ancestors, and you know, our approach to that. So hopefully that's an okay thing to ask you, Marenka.
Thanks, Beth, and I will try to answer it the best I can. I mean, I think that that was a very excellent question and very true. And I know one of the things that we've talked about also is about like sometimes like when we say, you know, objects or things, we are creating this kind of separation. And so sometimes we use the term possessions to kind of bring back the fact that, hey, there are like people connected and to these objects. But I think it's also kind of very hard in just like the way that our database and every system is almost set up within the museum to make that to kind of move away from that break between like object and people. And I think that partly without kind of like really rethinking how we like create quote unquote databases, we won't ever really be able to move beyond that. And that's like something I've been thinking a lot about in the new collecting that I've been doing that somebody mentioned, I think it's Beth, is that when we bring in these kind of new objects, you know, how then within the actual like acquisition and like writing up of, you know, the kind of process and contracts of how these objects come into the museum, it's writing into that the idea that these are not just simply, as we think, like things or objects, but actually they have this much longer like lifespan and these people around them. I think people who created them, but people in the future, in the past, I think, and it has to almost encompass all of that within it. And I'm like literally right now in like currently trying to figure out how to like write up that process to illustrate all that. And the only way I can do that is by sitting down. I'm sitting down with the indigenous artists that I'm working with and talking through like all the points. It's just of kind of, there's this sentence in this contract that has like so much jargon, but we also have to like, which I can't like understand. We need to break that down. But then, and when we finally figure out, hey, what is this saying? Then we be like, well, no, that is not actually how we see said object. Like, you know, especially when collecting from contemporary artists, because we then call it like, quote unquote, we call it art. But I also see this as not just art, but it's a cultural practice and heritage, which means that it has cultural significance and importance, which, hey, we might not see that fully now, but maybe that might be really important to future generations of that community. So then I need to write that into the contract that, you know, there is provisions for them in the future as well. And so in that way, I think like I'm trying a little bit then to kind of break down this divide, if that makes any sense. But as I said, I'm like in the middle of it, and it is hard, but it's actually really fun. But it also just made me realize how much like of all our systems and every step of that process is created to almost block that like connection between people and things, which you don't really think about because, you know, we think of a museum as people come to see objects. But
I do wonder if this issue we have with trying to like capture everything is like a museum issue whereby actually some stuff doesn't need to be captured, you know, like it just happens, or whatever. Like obviously a lot does have to be captured, but how you capture it and then like for what purpose? And to think that object lives, so like an object had a life and then it came to the museum and then it doesn't really have a life because it's here now. Like a life of an object is many like stages, right? And its life continues in the museum. With interactions, with every interaction it has. And I think like it came up in the chat, or it was a question about contemporary artists as well, and like what we do with kind of capturing that and how we'd categorize it. So, you know, our database has a really stupid categorization. We categorize things as either A, archaeology, or E, ethnography. Like why? And what? Like what even, you know, is ethnography, archaeology, contemporary art? Like how does this all fit, and what's the use of those categorizations? But I think we're beginning to do more with contemporary artists. Marenka, Andy has had a lot of experience, and so we're kind of learning. But I think that this issue we have of like trying to capture everything, like even interventions. So a lot of what we're doing to our permanent displays are kind of interventions. Put them in, they disturb things, then we take them out. Like that's fine, that's okay. An intervention for something to be like a short-lived thing is fine, but as long as that's fine, as long as our actual kind of practices and systems are still being affected and influenced and changing as a result of the more temporary things. And also bringing humanity to a situation. We're all human, like just the hider, it was harrowing. Like I was in a room with them when they were seeing these frontlets at times, and we're just sobbing because, you know, that was for them the first time they'd seen these things worn by their chiefs, and it's emotionally draining. Like a white person working in a museum with all this colonial stuff. But equally there were times of like really funny, humorous times of the hider, like a good hider friend who I kind of made during that trip, and also saw when I went back to Vancouver on loan, Nika Collison. She'd come into a room and every time she saw an object she'd be like, oh my god, no frigging way. She was so excited by like literally everything, and it became her kind of catchphrase, and it was really like fun, and we'd just laugh whenever she came in the room because we knew that she'd like get really excited.
And I really like that because that's like bringing that kind of joy back. And I realize we don't have a lot more time for our conversation, but it's like, you know, the museums need to like capture everything, and then like we have labels which mean that we have to like traduce everything again, but actually do we need to capture everything? And then actually are there different ways in which we can do it? And I know, Marenka, you'll have so much more to say on this, and we need like, you know, hours longer to think this through together. And I know we haven't heard from Tandy as much as we'd like to. So
I did have one question for her.
Yeah, she got great.
Tandy, can I ask you a quick question?
Go for it, Marenka.
So I think in your presentation you talked about the Weaving Connections online digital exhibition, and I remember you mentioned talking about kind of using non-hierarchical symbols within that. And I think this also goes very much for the database and how, you know, we create hierarchies within the database and the classifications. But what I thought was really interesting about it is, like, I think a lot of people don't even think about the design process of the exhibition itself. And this is a digital exhibition, but like you consciously thought about obviously the words, but also like the symbols, which are a form of label and communication, right? And how to create non-hierarchical symbols. I just wanted you to kind of expound on that a little bit more.
Yeah, so we worked very closely with Creative J, who were wonderful, and we had a consultation session with all the digital Multaka volunteers, and they brought up this question of, you know, are the symbols you're using, you know, are they hierarchical? And we didn't want them to be at all. We wanted the motifs to be, you know, accessible and recognizable, so you saw it, you go, right, that's what that information is, I'll click on it. And we ended up, there were lots of different buttons that were provided to us by the designers, things like pencils, speech bubbles, tiny little labels, little Pitt Rivers looking labels, and those were very tempting, but of course with the Labeling Matters project we're aware that some of the handwritten labels are a little bit problematic, so we were wondering, does that translate in a digital atmosphere? And we ended up
we ended up choosing speech bubbles for information or research that volunteers and Jenny Balfour-Poole herself had. And we used this I button, which caused a little bit of an issue because we were wondering, I for information, is that hierarchical? But we used that in the end because it was just clear, it wasn't cryptic, that it was just some extra information on the side, which complemented everyone's incredible research. And that was used where any of the 4 curators wrote information, just extra little tidbits here and there.
Great. I think I'm going to have to stop you there. I mean, I think there's a lot more conversation to have here. There's a whole load of questions, and I'm sorry to people whose questions we just didn't get around to asking because there were just too many of them. But I would really like to thank our panel for really insightful thoughts about the kind of work that we're all involved in and the different ways in which we do that work, and also to the amazing chat that's been going on at the side as well, which I have captured, and we can only see some of it, but we'll have a really good look at that. And clearly this has really got people thinking, but we do have to call a day on it now, I think. So thank you for attending this evening's meeting. Let's try that again. This evening's event. Please do fill in the survey. Link's going to come up right at the end. So massive thank you to Marenka, to Faye, to Tandy, and to Beth, and of course to you, our wonderful audience, and to Brittany and Misa, who've been kind of behind the scenes and don't get seen. Our next event will be on Wednesday, the 10th of March, part of a collection of events called Living Cultures, and examines an ongoing relationship between Pitt Rivers, representatives of the Maasai in East Africa, and Insight Share, a British NGO. You can book it now. And one of the questions which we didn't get to answer from Ashley about how we address information that comes in from impacted communities. That talk in 2 weeks' time, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at. We don't know the answers, but it is a journey that we're on and many museums are on, and it's a really exciting thing to be a part of. So please do join us in 2 weeks' time, and today's event will be on YouTube, probably by the end of tomorrow, certainly by midday Friday, with most or all of the glitches removed. Thank you for your involvement and have a great evening. Good night.